Hey guys, tonight we're going to step onto a road that isn't really a road at all. It's more like a giant tangled web of trails, caravan paths, oasis stops, and whispered rumors stretching from the heart of China to the shores of the Mediterranean. They called it the Silk Road, but that name, like a designer label sewn onto a piece of clothing, came much later. At the time, no merchant set out saying, "Well, I'm off to the Silk Road." They were just trying to sell something shiny, or buy something tasty, or quite often simply to make it home alive with all their fingers and their camels intact. So before we get too serious, make yourself comfortable. Maybe tuck in, dim the lights. Like the caravans that once huddled around their campfires under the stars, we'll travel slowly and carefully tonight. And by the way, if you enjoy this sleepy wander through history, give the video a little subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always imagine someone in London dozing off while someone in Manila is sipping morning coffee. The Silk Road was global, long before globalization was cool. Picture this. The desert sky above you is a dark velvet scattered with too many stars to count. A line of camels sways like ships on a black ocean of sand. The bells tied around their necks chime in slow rhythm. Somewhere, a trader is cursing under his breath because his sandal strap broke again. The fire crackles, spitting sparks. A pot of thin soup simmers, flavored with whatever roots the caravan's cook managed to scrape up. And in those tired eyes, staring into the flames, lies the same thought: I wonder if we'll make it tomorrow. That's the real Silk Road, not the polished maps and textbooks, but sweat dust and long, anxious nights. It was dangerous, yes, but also enchanting. Because on this road, you might trade salt for silk glass, for jade wine for horses, and without realizing it, you might also trade ideas, your God for someone else's, your music for a foreign instrument, your spice for a story. But before we jump straight into the spicy stew of cultural exchange, let's rewind. How did this all begin? Oddly enough, with fear. Fear of nomadic raiders swooping down on Chinese farms like hawks on mice. We're in the 2nd century BC. The Han dynasty is young, ambitious, and constantly harassed by a confederation of steppe horsemen known as the Xiongnu. They are everything that Chinese farmers are not: mobile, tough, and annoyingly good at stealing sheep. Emperor Wu of Han, who comes to power in 141 BC, realizes that if he doesn't deal with them, his empire might unravel, like a poorly tied bundle on a camel's back. So what does he do? He sends a man named Zhang Qian westward, not with silk to sell, but with a mission: find allies. Think of Zhang as an ancient spy, Joss, diplomat, Indiana Jones, rolled into one, minus the fedora. He sets out with about 100 men. He doesn't get far before the Xiongnu capture him. Oops. Instead of killing him, though they keep him around for over 10 years. A decade of polite hostage life, 10 years to observe how nomads live, breed horses, and strike deals across Central Asia. Finally, he escapes, and when he makes it back to the Han court, 13 years later, he's got nothing useful in terms of allies. But he does have one dazzling piece of intelligence: Chinese silk is already out there. It is leaked like perfume, escaping a sealed jar into distant markets, where it fetches astonishing prices. Imagine Emperor Wu's eyebrows rising higher with every sentence of Zhang's report. The mission failed politically, but it planted the first seed of a commercial empire. That's where our story begins to shimmer. Because silk wasn't just fabric, it was a flex. In Rome, centuries later, senators would sigh that silk was draining their treasury Roman gold, pouring eastward, just so their wives could wear translucent gowns that scandalized the moralists. In Persia, it became a currency of diplomacy. Along every oasis, stop silk was prestige, silk was power. And the best part, only China knew how to make it. For centuries, the method of coaxing thread out of the humble silkworm was guarded as tightly as nuclear launch codes today. But back in Emperor Wu's time, the whole thing still looked more like survival than globalization. Picture a caravan leaving Chang'an, the Han capital silk, bundled up lacquered boxes, strapped down bronze mirrors shining faintly. The merchants tighten their belts and say goodbye to their families, knowing full well there's a non-zero chance they'll never see them again. Ahead lies the Tarim Basin, a gigantic natural death trap of deserts ringed by mountains so high they steal your breath. And yet off they go. Why? Because of hope. Hope that at the end of this long chain of trade, someone will pay silver or gold or horses or maybe just enough food to keep the family alive back home. Hope that tomorrow's road might be kinder than today's. There's something deeply human about that, isn't there? We chase possibility even through sandstorms. We dream of what lies beyond the horizon. And in chasing, we build connections far larger than ourselves. The Silk Road is really the story of that chase. Tonight, as we begin this journey together, keep that image in mind: a dark desert, a tired caravan, a thread of silk slipping from hand to hand across thousands of miles. This road was never a straight highway. It was fragile, improvised, sometimes collapsing entirely. And yet, for more than 1,000 years, it stitched empires together like a giant patchwork quilt. In the coming parts, we'll follow that quilt as it grows stitched with the ambitions of emperors, the greed of merchants, the devotion of monks, and the restless curiosity of travelers who carried not just goods, but entire worlds of ideas. From China to Rome, from desert to sea, from silk to spices to gunpowder and plague. But for now, let's linger in that desert night a little longer. The stars are bright, the camels are chewing, and the fire is low. The Silk Road has just begun. So there's Emperor Wu of Han, sitting in his court around 140 BC, staring at maps that look more like riddles than road guides. He's got a problem, well more like an itch that keeps him up at night. The Xiongnu, nomadic horsemen of the northern steppes. Imagine raiders who can ride 50 miles in a day, fire arrows backwards, while galloping and vanish into the grasslands before anyone can mount a defense. To the settled farmers of northern China, these guys were like the ultimate nightmare, an enemy you couldn't fence out, couldn't chase down, and definitely couldn't bribe with a bag of rice. The dynasty had tried a softer touch. Earlier, emperors signed peace treaties, even sending princesses to marry Xiongnu leaders in a desperate attempt at we're all family. Now please stop stealing our cows. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. The raids kept coming, and Emperor Wu wasn't exactly a fan of appeasement. He wanted to strike back, but hitting the Xiongnu head-on was like trying to punch fog. It never stayed where you thought it was. So he hatched a gamble. What if we hit them from behind? Not personally, of course. Emperors don't saddle horses for stealth attacks. But what if some distant tribe could be persuaded to pinch the Xiongnu from the west, while the Han armies pushed from the east? A perfect pincer movement, the kind of thing generals dream about while doodling battle maps in the dirt. But here's the snag. These distant allies were more legend than fact. Courtiers whispered about the Yuezhi, a people who'd been bullied out of their homelands by the Xiongnu decades earlier. Word was, they'd wandered far into Central Asia, nursing a grudge. If Wu could find them, convince them to join forces, maybe, just maybe, the Han could break the Xiongnu stranglehold. Enter Zhang Qian. Imagine a palace attendant, smart, loyal, maybe a bit too ambitious for his own good. When the emperor needed someone reckless enough to walk into the unknown, Zhang's name rose to the top. His orders were straightforward, on paper trek into lands no Chinese official had ever dared find the Yuezhi and talk them into revenge. Easy, right? Like asking your neighbor's cousin's cousin for a favor, except the neighbor lives 1,000 miles away, over deserts, mountains, and enemy territory. In 138 BC, Zhang set out with 100 men. You can picture the caravan at dawn, banners fluttering the Han court, no doubt imagining triumphal returns. Enemy alliances, sealed silk banners waving in the wind. Instead, within days of leaving home, turf disaster struck. The Xiongnu pounced, and the whole party was captured. That's not great for morale. Now here's where the story takes a twist. Instead of killing Zhang outright, the Xiongnu decided to keep him. They weren't stupid. This was a well-dressed envoy of the Han Emperor. Killing him might provoke bigger trouble, so they put him under a kind of golden cage arrangement, comfortable captivity. He lived among them for over a decade. 10 years. That's enough time to raise kids, grow old, or binge-watch a very long TV series. While stuck there, Zhang Qian did what any curious hostage might. He watched. He learned. He saw how the nomads bred their horses, how they lived in felt tents that could be packed in minutes, how their warriors seemed to melt into the horizon. He listened to their trading chatter, their dealings with other nomads and distant oasis towns. In a sense, Zhang's captivity gave him something no diplomat had ever had before: a crash course in the interconnected web of Central Asia. Eventually, he escaped, romantic legend says, with the help of his Xiongnu-born wife and a handful of loyal followers. Whether or not that detail is true, what matters is that he made it west. And when he finally staggered into Bactria, far beyond the Pamirs, he found the Yuezhi. Did they leap up, shout revenge, and grab their swords? No. By then, they'd settled down quite happily in fertile lands, sipping local wine, enjoying trade profits, and frankly, not interested in reliving old grudges. The Emperor's plan, his grand gamble, was a bust. But here's the twist of fate that makes history delicious. Though Zhang Qian failed militarily, he succeeded spectacularly in another way. In Bactria, he spotted something jaw-dropping: Chinese silk. His people's silk in foreign markets worn by strangers who had no idea how many worms had to spin themselves silly to make it. And it was selling for ridiculous prices. The thread that began in the mulberry groves of the Yangtze had somehow traveled across thousands of miles, passed from hand to hand through unknown middlemen, until it shimmered in Western bazaars. Zhang Qian realized what Emperor Wu did not yet know. China's most delicate luxury was already halfway to conquering the world, not with swords, but with thread. When Zhang finally limped back to China 13 years after he'd left, the emperor listened with rapt attention. No allies, no army disappointing, but a road of riches stretching westward, paved in silk, that caught his interest. Wu wasn't a sentimental ruler, but he understood economics. If there was a way to turn Chinese silk into foreign silver to feed an imperial treasury already stretched by wars, then maybe the hardships had been worth it. And so the gamble, which began as a military ploy, morphed into something larger. Instead of breaking the Xiongnu with an alliance, the Han would break open the world with trade. Zhang Qian's mission, born of war, became the seed of a commerce that would outlast dynasties. Imagine him reporting the lands he saw, the fruits, the horses with sweat like jewels, the cities where silk fetched 10 times its price. Imagine the court scribes trying to keep up as he spilled details of mountains taller than the sky deserts that could swallow armies, people who worshipped unfamiliar gods and wore clothes like painted clouds. The Han court must have buzzed with a mixture of disbelief, greed, and awe. And so, with one man's broken sandals and decade of captivity, the Silk Road's first real path was sketched not on parchment, but in the imagination of an emperor who had gambled everything on war and stumbled instead into history's greatest marketplace. As the fires in the imperial palace dimmed and the whispers of merchants began to stir, one thing was certain: China had found its door to the world. It had only to be opened wider. Jiang Qian came back to China in 126 BC, looking like he'd aged a century. 13 years away from home will do that to you, especially when most of it was spent either as a captive or wandering deserts where the sun tries to roast you like a dumpling left on a hot pan. He must have walked into Emperor Wu's presence with dust still in his hair and stories stacked higher than his pack animals could carry. But let's be honest, the alliance plan had flopped. The Yuezhi were not interested in charging back into the steppes. They had traded their tents for vineyards and were in no mood to chase revenge. From a military perspective, Jiang Qian had failed. If this had been a normal emperor, he might have been executed or at least demoted to some humiliating post, like assistant keeper of the imperial pigs. But Wu of Han was no ordinary ruler. He wasn't interested only in battles. He was also a gambler at heart, with the mind of a businessman. And what Jiang Qian brought back was far more enticing than another enemy alliance, a vision of a world where China wasn't a frightened eastern corner, but the beating heart of global commerce. The stories he told must have sounded like fairy tales. He described vast cities in Bactria, with bustling markets where merchants haggled over precious stones, fine horses, and yes, Chinese silk. The emperor's ears must have perked up at that one. Silk, his silk. China's silk was already making its way westward, without any official permission, slipping like contraband through countless hands. And it was selling for prices so high, it made the Han court's own valuations look almost laughable. Each step of the journey inflated its worth until a single bolt of silk could pay for a nobleman's villa. Imagine the ripple of shock in the court. Silk wasn't just clothing, it was status. The process of making it was guarded as tightly as the recipe for Coca-Cola today. To discover that this secret treasure was already halfway across Asia must have felt like finding out your family recipe was being sold in Paris without you ever tasting the profits. That was the spark. The diplomatic mission might have fizzled, but the commercial flame caught. Wu of Han realized that if silk could travel that far informally, then imagine what could happen if the empire itself controlled the flow. Instead of losing money to endless wars, he could refill his treasury with silk caravans stretching westward, bringing back not only silver, but horses' jade glass and exotic wonders no one in Chang'an had ever seen before. But before we imagine great caravans setting off, let's pause. Because this is where the Silk Road's magic really begins. Not in treaties, not in battles, but in the simple, irresistible pull of profit and curiosity. Picture the scene: a Han merchant setting up his wares in an official frontier market. Rolls of shimmering silk piled like little mountains of moonlight. A lacquered box, polished so smooth you could see your reflection. Bronze mirrors, ceramic spices. Across from him, a Sogdian trader, sunburnt, sharp-eyed, speaking a dozen languages badly, but enough to get his meaning across. He lays out his own treasures: lapis lazuli, the color of frozen sky's glass, so clear it looks like trapped water horses bred to run like the wind. Neither man knows much about the other's homeland, but each knows the universal language of value. The bargaining begins. Voices rise, hands wave dramatically, and in the end, both walk away with a mix of relief, pride, and the quiet suspicion they may have been cheated. That dance, awkward, chaotic, and very human, was the real heartbeat of the Silk Road. It wasn't designed. It wasn't a master plan. It grew out of failure patched together by merchants who simply wanted to make a little more than they had yesterday. And yet something else began to flow alongside the goods. Ideas. A Sogdian merchant might return home not only with silk, but with a story of how the Chinese measure time by heavenly cycles. A Chinese envoy might carry back not only a horse, but a hint of how far the land stretched, how many kingdoms lay beyond. Slowly, step by step, the world was stitching itself together. What Zhang Qian had really uncovered wasn't just silk as popular abroad. He had glimpsed an invisible network, a chain of oasis towns, desert guides, nomadic alliances, and middlemen who made sure goods kept moving. The road wasn't a highway paved and ordered. It was a shifting set of possibilities. A safe passage today might be closed tomorrow by a local warlord. A well might dry up. A tribe might decide to double their tolls, or worse, ambush the caravan outright. But still, merchants kept trying because the rewards glittered too brightly to ignore. Emperor Wu, ever the strategist, leaned into this. If he couldn't smash the Xiongnu outright, he could at least outtrade them. He established markets at the empire's edges, where foreigners could come under watchful eyes, exchange goods, and leave behind silver and gold. He sent Zhang Qian back west this time, not to beg for alliances, but to open channels of trade. And slowly, a habit formed: Chinese silk, going out foreign treasures, coming in all flowing through dusty passes and treacherous deserts. Think of it as the first sparks catching tinder. The flame is small now, just a handful of caravans, just a trickle of silk. But soon it will spread. Soon silk will adorn Roman senators. Buddhist sutras will ride on camelbacks into China. Glass and grapes and walnuts will mingle with peaches and apricots. And somewhere along the way, a tiny bacterium will hitch a ride and change the world in a far darker way. But that's later. For now, what matters is this: the Silk Road was born not from triumph, but from failure. A failed alliance, a wasted mission, a man stumbling back, half dead, from years in captivity. Out of that failure came a vision, a spark that said, what if we connect? What if we trade? What if my world could touch yours? And that's the story of humanity, isn't it? We fail at one thing, and by accident, we stumble into something greater. The campfires are burning brighter now. Caravans load their silks with tighter knots. The desert winds whisper of profits waiting in distant markets. The road is still fragile, still uncertain, but the spark has caught. And soon, the whole world will feel its glow. Before we gallop too far down the road, we need to stop and peek into the smallest workshop of all a mulberry grove, where tiny worms are munching their way into history. Because without those little creatures, there would be no Silk Road. Imagine it: no caravans shimmering with bolts of fabric, no Roman matrons swooning over translucent gowns, no Tang poets comparing love to silk threads. All of it began with bugs chewing leaves. The Chinese had cracked the secret long before anyone else. The story, like all good inventions, has a mythic touch: a cup of tea, an empress, and a cocoon that slipped into hot water. The fibers unraveled and voila, silk. Was it really that simple? Probably not. But it makes for a good bedtime image, doesn't it? A sleepy empress watching steam curl above her cup, tugging at a thread that stretches on and on. In reality, producing silk was painstaking, almost ritualistic. First, mulberry trees had to be cultivated because silkworms are picky little aristocrats. They don't just eat any old leaf. They demand mulberry. Then came the worm farms, thousands upon thousands of fat, squirming larvae, tended like royal babies. They ate constantly day and night until their little bodies swelled with stored energy. When the time came, they spun cocoons around themselves, each one a capsule of delicate, glistening thread, up to a mile of filament locked in a single oval. The trick was to get that thread without letting the moth hatch and break it. That meant boiling or steaming the cocoon, softening the gum that glued the fibers together. Then patient hands teased the filaments loose, reeling them onto spindles, twisting several together to make something strong enough to weave. The result? A fabric that shimmered, that breathed in hot summers, that draped like liquid light. Nothing else in the ancient world came close. And the Chinese guarded it with the paranoia of a dragon hoarding treasure. The methods of silk production were state secrets. Smuggling silkworm eggs or mulberry seeds could earn you death. There were officials whose entire job was making sure no foreigner glimpsed too much of the process. Silk was not just a luxury, it was a monopoly, a weapon of soft power. By keeping the secret, China controlled the market. Every bolt that left its borders was a silent ambassador of the empire's wealth and mystery. Think about how extraordinary that is. For over 2,000 years, people bought silk without knowing how it was made. Imagine owning a smartphone, but having no idea it runs on electricity, only rumors about magic sparks inside. To the Romans, silk seemed almost supernatural. Some thought it grew on trees like shimmering leaves that could be plucked in the right season. Others imagined it was combed from exotic sheep that grazed in distant lands. Writers guessed, merchants speculated, but the truth stayed hidden in the mulberry groves of China. It wasn't just secrecy, it was also scale. Silk required an enormous workforce. Families and villages across the Yangtze Basin became expert spinners and weavers. Generations passed down techniques for dyeing the fabric into colors that glowed like jewels: deep reds, lush greens, luminous yellows. Each bolt carried the fingerprints of countless hours of labor, each thread a line in the great novel of Chinese craftsmanship. And yet, despite its fragility, silk was astonishingly durable on the road. Wrapped tightly, it resisted damp heat and rough handling better than most goods. Merchants loved it because it packed value into small spaces. One camel could carry enough silk to finance a year's worth of trade. Try that with sacks of grain, and you'd be laughed out of the caravan. The secrecy also fueled its mystique. When a Roman lady draped herself in a translucent silk gown, she wasn't just wearing a fabric, she was wearing mystery itself. The fabric whispered of unknown lands, of distant monarchs of deserts, where men and camels disappeared into mirages. The allure was more than physical, it was psychological. Silk said, "I have something you don't, and you'll never know how it's made." And of course, the irony is that the Chinese government itself couldn't control everything. Smugglers eventually did slip silkworm eggs out, most famously, according to legend, with a Buddhist monk who hid them inside a hollow staff or in the folds of a headdress. But for centuries, that monopoly held strong enough to build an empire's fortune. Back in Han times, though, it was still pristine. The secret was locked tight, and silk's reputation was growing with every caravan. Emperor Wu leaned into it, sending bolts west, not only as gifts, but as strategic tools. Silk could buy allies, bribe warlords, and sweeten treaties. Soldiers might march for gold, but chieftains were known to fight for a cloak that shimmered like dawn. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a loom in a Han village. Wooden beams creak, the shuttle clicks back and forth, threads tighten into a pattern that looks simple but feels miraculous. Outside, mulberry trees sway in the breeze. Children chase silkworm moths that escape the boiling pot, fluttering clumsily into the air. It's ordinary life, yet it's also the heartbeat of an empire's most valuable secret. That's the paradox of the Silk Road. Its greatest treasure wasn't mined from the ground or conquered in war. It was coaxed out of leaves and worms, spun by human patience, guarded by fear of betrayal. And from that fragile cocoon, came a thread that bound worlds together. So when you hear Silk Road, don't just picture camels and deserts. Picture a cocoon steaming in a pot, a thread unwinding into a spindle, and an emperor smiling because the world's most coveted fabric was his alone to sell. The secret would spread one day, yes. But for now, in the 2nd century BC, it belonged to China. And from that shimmering monopoly, a road of silk began to stretch westward. Imagine you're leaving the fertile valleys of China, your camels loaded with bolts of silk wrapped in protective cloth. Behind you, the empire's fields and rivers fade into memory. Ahead lies a place so vast and unforgiving that even the word desert feels too gentle. This is the Tarim Basin, a gigantic bowl surrounded by mountain walls, its floor filled with one of the deadliest deserts on Earth, the Taklamakan. The name alone tells you everything in the local tongue. It means something like, "Go in and you won't come out." Not exactly the kind of tourist slogan you'd print on a postcard. The Taklamakan is a sea of shifting dunes, some taller than skyscrapers stretching for hundreds of miles. In summer, the sand can burn at 50 degrees Celsius. In winter, it can freeze you to the bone. Water is scarce, mirages taunt the thirsty, and sandstorms can bury a caravan alive in a matter of minutes. And yet the Silk Road threaded its way through here, like a fragile cord pulled tight between life and death. The trick was not to cross the middle, but to skirt the edges. And along those edges lay the lifelines of trade, the oasis cities. They were little green miracles, patches of fertile land, fed by streams, trickling down from glaciers in the surrounding mountains. Without them, no one could hope to survive the journey. First stop Kashgar perched at the western edge of the Tarim Basin, where roads from every direction converge. Think of it as the beating heart of the Silk Road, a city where caravans from China, India, Persia, and the steppes all bumped elbows in noisy bazaars. Imagine its streets, spice sellers shouting prices, horse traders boasting about pedigrees, and silk merchants guarding their precious bolts with a hand always near the money pouch. The city's rulers understood their value and taxed travelers accordingly. But they also invested in infrastructure wells, storage houses, markets divided neatly by goods. If the Silk Road had a central station, Kashgar was it. Then there was Khotan, farther south. It wasn't just a pit stop. It was famous in its own right for jade, pale, milky stones prized in China for centuries. Local artisans carved it into ritual discs, belt buckles, and ornaments so fine they looked as if moonlight itself had been shaped into solid form. Khotan's craftsmen also picked up silk production themselves, developing unique weaving techniques that gave their fabrics a slightly different sheen from Chinese silk. If Kashgar was the hub, Khotan was the jeweler's shop of the desert. And don't forget Turfan, down in a depression so low it's actually below sea level. Turfan was blisteringly hot, but it had ingenious irrigation channels, underground, canals called karez, that carried meltwater from the mountains. Its vineyards produced grapes and wines that astonished travelers used to harsher fare. Merchants praised Turfan's ability to supply fresh food vital after long stretches of dry rations. Its people also had a reputation for selling maps guides, and the one thing more valuable than silk in the desert knowledge of where to find water. Because here's the truth. Survival on the Silk Road was as much about information as goods. You could have a camel loaded with treasure, but if you missed a well by half a mile, none of it mattered. Desert guides passed down knowledge like heirlooms, where springs bubbled up, which dunes concealed hidden paths, when to travel to avoid sandstorms. This was wisdom, bought with generations of suffering. Still, even with guides, danger was never far. Picture a caravan crawling along the southern rim of the desert. The sun beats down. The camels groan. A dust storm sweeps in, suddenly turning day to night. Traders clutch at ropes tied between them so no one vanishes into the whirl of grit. When the storm passes, sometimes half the animals are gone, suffocated under the dunes. And yet when the survivors stagger into the next oasis and taste fresh water, the first thing many do is reload, regroup, and press on. Because profit lay ahead, and profit was worth the gamble. If the desert was merciless, the mountains were no kinder. To the west of the Tarim rose the Pamirs, known to ancient travelers as the roof of the world. Their passes soared to 20,000 feet. Snow blocked them for much of the year. Avalanches, sudden storms, and thin air tormented both humans and animals. A misstep on a frozen ledge could send a camel tumbling into oblivion, its load of silk scattered like feathers in the wind. But there was no avoiding the passes. They were the gateway to Bactria Sogdiana and the wider west. Merchants adapted with remarkable ingenuity. Horses were swapped for yaks in the highlands. Furs were packed against the cold. Travelers learned to climb slowly, letting their lungs adjust and to read the clouds for signs of oncoming storms. They hired local mountain peoples as guides, men and women, who knew which rocks hid caves for shelter, which plants hinted at hidden springs. Without them, even the most determined caravan would vanish. And yet, imagine the reward of cresting a mountain pass after weeks of grinding effort. The world opens beneath you, valleys, dotted with villages, rivers gleaming like silver ribbons, markets waiting at the other end. The silence of the high peaks gives way to the bustle of trade, the promise of new partners, new goods, new stories. This rhythm desert oasis, mountain valley, was the drumbeat of the Silk Road. The journey was punishing, but it carried its own strange poetry. A merchant leaving Chang'an might never reach Rome, but his silk might. Hand to hand, step by step, it would cross deserts and mountains, changing owners' languages and currencies along the way, until it finally draped the shoulders of a senator's wife in the Forum. And all of it depended on these fragile corridors through the Tarim Basin and the Pamirs, the gates of deserts and snow. At night, in those oases, travelers swapped tales. Some were cautionary ghost stories of caravans swallowed by dunes of frozen bodies, found in the passes still clutching the ropes of their camels. Others were wondrous accounts of lands where rivers ran with wine, or where horses sweated blood, or where glass was so clear it seemed made of frozen air. Truth and exaggeration blurred, but the stories themselves were currency traded with as much value as silk. The Silk Road wasn't just a map of dirt paths. It was a map of human endurance. Every oasis, every mountain pass was a reminder that survival required cooperation between merchants, between guides, between strangers who could barely understand each other's words, but knew the same hunger, the same thirst, the same hope of tomorrow. And so, through the Tarim Basin with its deserts that devoured and mountains that froze, the first great arteries of the Silk Road took shape. Fragile, dangerous, miraculous. A road stitched together by human stubbornness and the lure of profit-opening gates that would never fully close again. If silk was China's shimmering gift to the world, then horses were the world's thundering gift back to China. And not just any horses, these were the Fergana stallions, sometimes called heavenly horses. To Chinese eyes, they seemed touched by divinity. To generals, they were worth more than gold. And to Emperor Wu of Han, they were nothing less than the key to survival against the terrifying power of the Xiongnu. Let's rewind. The Han armies had plenty of horses, but most were small, shaggy creatures, more useful for pulling carts than charging across steppes. Against the Xiongnu cavalry, nomads who practically lived in the saddle, Han troops struggled. Imagine a farmer drafted into service, wobbling on a short-legged horse, trying to chase an enemy who could ride for days without rest. The imbalance was painful to watch. Then Zhang Qian returned from his long, miserable mission. Among his many observations of Western lands, one detail stood out in Fergana, modern-day Uzbekistan. There were horses unlike any the Han had ever seen. Tall, strong, elegant, with chests like drums and legs that could devour miles of open land. The locals even boasted that when they ran hard, their sweat dripped red, as if the beasts bled for battle. Some historians suggest it was parasites or reddish skin secretions, but to the Chinese, it was a sign of heavenly fire coursing through their veins. You can almost picture Emperor Wu's face when he heard it. To him, these were not just animals, they were weapons. A cavalry mounted on Fergana horses could finally meet the Xiongnu on equal terms, perhaps even overwhelm them. So the emperor did what emperors do when they want something. He demanded it. The Han court sent envoys west with rich gifts, silk jade lacquerware, hoping to persuade the Fergana kings to part with their precious stock. But diplomacy has a way of going sour when pride collides with greed. The Fergana rulers, suspicious of Chinese ambitions, turned the envoys away. Some were even killed. Insult added to injury. Emperor Wu was not the forgiving type. In 104 BC, he ordered military expeditions into Central Asia, not just for glory, but specifically to seize those horses. Imagine it: entire armies marching thousands of miles into unfamiliar lands, braving deserts and mountains just to capture a breeding herd. That's how desperately the Han wanted them. The campaigns were brutal. The first invasion stumbled, logistics failed, the deserts drained men and supplies, and many never returned. But Wu persisted. A second larger expedition followed. This time, the Han stormed into Fergana, besieging its cities, and after fierce fighting, the rulers finally relented. The price: they had to hand over some of their prized horses, along with the promise of more tribute animals each year. It sounds excessive, invading a kingdom for horses, but remember, to the Han, these creatures were living engines of empire. A single stallion could sire dozens of foals, each one a future warhorse. Within a generation, the Han cavalry was transformed. Mounted on heavenly horses, Chinese troops became faster, deadlier, and far harder to intimidate. The empire's borders, once fragile, solidified under the thunder of hooves. And in this obsession, we glimpse something crucial about the Silk Road. It wasn't just about luxury goods. It was about survival technology and power. Silk made China rich, yes, but horses kept it safe. The road carried beauty one way and muscle the other. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a caravan returning east from Fergana. At the front, merchants lead camels loaded with jade and grapes, but tethered behind, strutting proudly, are a few magnificent stallions. Their manes ripple like banners, their nostrils flare with fire, their hooves strike sparks on stone. Soldiers watch them with awe, knowing these animals could decide the fate of battles. Farmers along the road stop their plowing just to stare. And somewhere in the imperial palace, Emperor Wu smiles at the thought that these creatures, half legend, half flesh, are now his. The horses also became symbols. Poets sang of their beauty. Artists painted them with proud arched necks and rolling eyes. Owning a Fergana horse was a mark of prestige, a status symbol as potent as any jewel. They embodied speed, freedom, and divine favor. For the Han, they were proof that the empire could reach out, seize what it desired, and turn distant wonders into its own strength. But of course, every gift carried risk. The more China reached west for horses, the more entangled it became in Central Asian politics. Envoys had to negotiate with unfamiliar rulers, pay bribes, and sometimes fight wars. The desire for horses pulled China deeper into the Silk Road, binding it to the fortunes of places it once barely knew existed. The road was no longer optional, it was essential. And here's the almost funny part. While the Chinese were desperate for horses, other lands were desperate for silk. So caravans began to resemble a cosmic barter system: silk for horses, fabric for hooves, beauty for strength. It's a reminder that trade isn't just about things, it's about needs. What one side craves, the other provides. And in that exchange, relationships, sometimes uneasy, sometimes violent, take shape. Think of the symbolism. Silk is delicate, shimmering, whisper thin. Horses are solid, thundering all muscle and breath. Together, they represent the dual nature of the Silk Road: softness and strength, luxury and survival. Without silk, the road wouldn't have dazzled. Without horses, it wouldn't have endured. So when we imagine the Silk Road, let's not just picture merchants haggling over spices or emperors draped in silk. Picture also the pounding of hooves echoing across deserts, the cloud of dust behind a cavalry, charge the gleam in a soldier's eye as he mounts a stallion that once belonged to a distant king. Because empires don't rise on silk alone. They rise on the backs of horses, especially the kind worth fighting wars to possess. And along the Silk Road, horses weren't just animals. They were destiny. Every great road has toll booths, and the Silk Road was no exception. Except instead of one booth with a grumpy guard, it had entire empires planted squarely in the middle, rubbing their hands and saying, "If you want to pass, you'll pay us first." Enter the Parthians. If China and Rome were the glamorous bookends of the Silk Road, the Parthians were the firm hand gripping the spine. From the 3rd century BC through the 3rd century AD, their empire sprawled from Iran to Mesopotamia, right across the land bridges every caravan had to cross. They were perfectly positioned, like the world's most ambitious middle managers, to control who traded where and for how much. Now here's the thing. The Parthians didn't produce silk. They didn't raise the heavenly horses that China coveted. They weren't even the most dazzling artisans. But what they had was geography. And geography is sometimes better than gold. They sat on the crossroads between east and west. If a caravan wanted to reach Rome, or a Roman merchant dreamed of silk, both had to cozy up to the Parthians first. Picture a caravan stumbling out of the Iranian plateau sand, in every pocket camels groaning with exhaustion. The merchants' eyes gleam with relief as they approach the bustling markets of Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, near the Tigris River. But relief is tempered with dread, because before they can sell a single bolt of silk, they face the imperial customs officials. Imagine them with ledgers, styluses poised, eyebrows raised. Declare your goods. Pay the duty. And don't even think about hiding anything. We've seen it all before. The Parthians taxed heavily, yes, but they also provided services. Their armies kept the routes relatively safe from bandits. They built caravanserais, those fortified inns where merchants could sleep without worrying their goods would vanish overnight. They maintained roads, sometimes even paving stretches for easier travel. In return for their tolls, they offered security and efficiency. Expensive, yes, but it was better than rolling the dice with raiders in the desert. And here's the sly genius: the Parthians never let Rome and China deal directly. Oh no. They made sure every transaction passed through their hands first, and with each handoff, they marked up the price. So by the time a bolt of Chinese silk reached a Roman market, its value had multiplied many times over. The Romans grumbled, complaining that their treasury was bleeding silver into the east. But they still paid, because silk was irresistible. The Parthians also became cultural brokers. Imagine their bazaars: Persian rugs lying next to Chinese silks, Indian spices scenting the air, Greek-style glass glittering in the stalls. Merchants haggled in a dozen tongues, while Parthian officials strolled the aisles, ears tuned for opportunity. They spoke enough of every language to bargain enough of every custom to mediate disputes. Their empire was a blender swirling together Greek, Persian, Mesopotamian, and nomadic influences into one cosmopolitan stew. But of course, time doesn't stand still. By the 3rd century AD, the Parthians fell to the rising Sassanids, another Persian dynasty fiercer and more centralized. The Sassanids took one look at the Silk Road and thought, yes, this will fund our empire nicely. They doubled down on infrastructure caravanserais, and yes, taxation. If the Parthians had been shrewd middle managers, the Sassanids were meticulous accountants. They created standardized tariffs, set up documentation for caravans, even monitored the quality of goods. A Roman merchant buying silk in Antioch might never see China, but thanks to Sassanid oversight, he could at least trust that the silk he purchased wasn't a cheap knockoff. In fact, some of the first attempts at international quality control happened right there, along the road, enforced by Sassanid scribes with wax tablets. The Sassanids also kept an eye on the cultural traffic. They promoted Zoroastrianism at home, but tolerated other religions so long as they didn't threaten stability. Nestorian Christians, Buddhists, Jews, and later Muslims all passed through, leaving traces in cities like Merv and Nishapur. In their temples, fire altars burned steadily, while down the street, caravans loaded goods for Rome, India, and beyond. It was a patchwork of faiths stitched together by profit. What's striking is how these middle empires, Parthian then Sassanid, profited not by invention, but by position. They didn't need to weave silk or mine jade. They needed only to stand at the doorway and say, "Welcome, traveler." That'll be 10%. And if the merchants groaned, well, what choice did they have? The only alternative was to brave deserts without wells, mountains without guides, and brigands without mercy. It's easy to mock the middlemen, but in truth, they were indispensable. Without them, the Silk Road might have collapsed under its own weight. Trade requires stability, and stability requires someone powerful enough to enforce rules. The Parthians and Sassanids played that role sometimes harshly, sometimes fairly, but always profitably. And so when you picture the Silk Road, don't imagine just two hands, China and Rome, reaching for each other across a map. Imagine a chain of hands, each passing the goods along, each taking a little slice for themselves. The Parthians' hands, the Sassanids' hands, even the calloused hands of caravan innkeepers and local toll collectors. The road was never free. It was paved with payments. But here's the twist: those tolls did more than fatten treasuries. They funded armies that defended the routes, cities that flourished on trade temples, and palaces that still leave ruins across Central Asia. Out of the taxes came culture, architecture, poetry, and learning. Middlemen might have slowed the flow of goods, but they enriched the soil around it. So the next time you hear someone complain about middlemen driving up prices, remember the Parthians. Without them, Rome might never have touched Chinese silk. Without them, ideas might never have flowed so smoothly. Sometimes the people in the middle are the ones who hold the whole road together. If the Parthians and Sassanids were the toll keepers of the Silk Road, then the Romans were the shopaholics, waiting at the far end purse strings wide open. And what they craved more than anything was silk. To a Roman eye, silk was unlike any fabric they had ever seen. Linen and wool, the staples of Mediterranean life, were sturdy, yes, but heavy. They didn't shimmer. They didn't float. When a Roman noblewoman draped herself in Chinese silk, it seemed to glow as if lit from within. It clung in ways that scandalized traditionalists, revealing more than a proper toga should. Imagine senators muttering in the forum, watching matrons glide past in gowns that seemed spun from moonlight. It was shocking, intoxicating, and utterly irresistible. Roman writers complained bitterly. Pliny the Elder grumbled that silk was draining the empire's treasury, estimating that Rome spent some 50 million sesterces a year, roughly 1% of its annual revenue, just to feed this luxury habit. He sighed that Roman men were being bankrupted, so their wives could flaunt translucent fabrics at dinner parties. Clothes made of silk, he scolded, afford protection neither to the body nor to modesty. In other words, the dresses were see-through, and Rome couldn't get enough of them. But outrage only made silk more desirable. Fashion thrives on rebellion. The more senators wagged their fingers, the more society ladies whispered about the latest imports. To wear silk was not just to wear fabric, it was to flaunt wealth, to challenge norms, to show you could afford what others only dreamed of touching. And in a city of 1 million souls, appearances mattered. The demand stretched far beyond the elite. Actors, courtesans, and merchants sought silk too, even if only scraps. It became a currency of seduction, a gift to woo lovers, a prize for gladiators, a prop in Roman theater, where exotic costumes added flair. Silk was not just material, it was social magic. And of course, every bolt of silk came at a staggering cost. By the time it reached Rome, it had passed through dozens of hands, each taking a cut. Caravans trudged from Chang'an to Central Asia, oasis to oasis. Parthian officials levied taxes. Middlemen marked up prices. Ships carried the goods across the Persian Gulf. More tolls, more markups. By the time it reached Mediterranean markets, Antioch, Tyre, Alexandria, the cost was astronomical. Yet the Romans still paid pouring rivers of gold and silver eastward. This imbalance worried Roman leaders. Gold, after all, was the lifeblood of the empire, paying legions, building aqueducts, greasing the wheels of politics. To watch it vanish into foreign coffers was unsettling. Some even proposed bans on silk imports. But the bans never stuck. Wealthy Romans simply found loopholes, smuggling in bolts, bribing officials, or disguising the fabric under layers of linen. Fashion always finds a way. The fascination ran so deep that Roman manufacturers tried to imitate silk. They experimented with spinning fine threads from plant fibers, even unraveling real silk to reweave it into coarser fabrics. But nothing matched the original. Chinese silk remained supreme, and Rome remained hooked. And here's the irony. While Romans lusted for silk, they had little idea where it actually came from. Some thought it grew on trees in distant Serica, a land so far away it might as well have been another planet. Others believed it was combed from the down of mythical creatures grazing in the east. The secret of the silkworm remained safe in China, leaving Romans to wrap themselves in mystery as well as luxury. The addiction had ripple effects. As silk poured west, so too did the idea of East as a land of wonders, remote, exotic, impossibly rich. Roman poets peppered their verses with references to Ceres, the mysterious people of silk. Roman generals dreamed of pushing further east to find the source, but geography, politics, and the Parthians stood in the way. The Silk Road remained a dream as much as a reality, a shimmering thread linking two worlds that never truly met face to face. Imagine a banquet in Rome during the reign of Augustus. Oil lamps glow. Musicians strum lutes. Servants glide between couches carrying platters of olives, roasted meats, and wine. And at the head table, a noblewoman reclines draped in a gown so fine it seems woven from starlight. Her friends gasp. Her rivals grit their teeth. Somewhere, a senator silently calculates how many legions' salaries could have been saved if she'd chosen wool instead. But the fabric whispers a different truth. Rome's wealth. Rome's power. Rome's appetite, all bound together in threads from the other side of the world. This is why the Silk Road mattered so deeply. It wasn't just about goods moving. It was about desires being fed, about identities being shaped. For the Romans, silk became more than clothing. It became a mirror of who they wanted to be: refined, worldly, untouchable. Even if it meant sending their empire's treasure chasing across deserts, up mountains, and through hands of 100 middlemen. And so, while Roman senators thundered about moral decay, while economists wrung their hands over lost silver, caravans kept coming, and merchants kept selling, and women kept shimmering through the streets of Rome. Because when has fashion ever bowed to politics? The Silk Road thrived not only because of emperors and generals, but because of something simpler: the human craving for beauty, for status, for a touch of magic. And silk was magic in tangible form. So the Roman addiction fed the road, kept caravans moving, kept middlemen rich, and kept China's silkworms munching mulberry leaves with tireless dedication. Empires rose and fell, but silk remained irresistible. So far, we've followed caravans loaded with silk jade horses and gold. Tangible things, shiny things, the kind of cargo that jingled in a purse or glittered on a noble's wrist. But the Silk Road wasn't just about merchandise. It was about something even more slippery, something you couldn't pack on a camel or measure on a scale: ideas. Close your eyes and imagine two merchants huddled around a fire in a wind-swept caravanserai. One is from India, his bundles stuffed with spices and sandalwood. The other is from Persia, his camels heavy with carpets and glassware. They share bread, perhaps a skin of wine, and in between bites, they trade more than goods. They swap stories about gods, about healing herbs, about the music their children dance to back home. And without fanfare, the Silk Road accomplishes its greatest feat. It makes cultures lean across the fire and listen to one another. Let's start with medicine. Chinese doctors were fascinated by Indian herbs. Greek and Roman physicians, in turn, picked up acupuncture needles and strange botanical remedies they didn't fully understand. A bundle of dried rhubarb might travel from Central Asia to a Roman apothecary, while knowledge of surgery and anatomy from the Mediterranean seeped back eastward. Picture a caravan doctor, part shaman, part field surgeon, his pack rattling with powders and tinctures. Every stop along the road gave him new recipes to test, some miraculous, some not so much. Let's just say drink. This powdered gemstone was not exactly a breakthrough in evidence-based medicine. Ideas about the stars traveled too. In the skies above the desert, every caravan relied on constellations. But which constellations mattered depended on who you asked. Chinese astronomers mapped heavenly cycles with an obsessive eye. Persians passed on instruments to measure them. And Arab scholars later combined the two into charts that still echo in today's astronomy. Imagine a weary traveler tilting his head back, tracing Orion or the Big Dipper, not knowing he's following a guidebook written by another civilization hundreds of miles away. Then there was music, the most portable cargo of all. A merchant could sell silk in one city, but he might also hum a tune he'd heard 2 stops ago. And that tune might stick in a local bard's head, mutating into something new. Instruments traveled too. The Chinese pipa descended from Central Asian lutes. Persian melodies slipped eastward, winding their way into Chinese court music. Think of it as the first world playlist, curated not by algorithms, but by caravan fiddlers and bored guards who needed something to pass the time. Art also flowed like watercolor bleeding across parchment. The Greco-Buddhist art of Gandhara, with its statues of the Buddha carved in robes that looked suspiciously Roman, is the perfect example. You can practically see Greek sculptors whispering through the stone, even as Buddhist monks commissioned them to depict enlightenment. Travelers carried sketches, motifs, and patterns. Artisans in Dunhuang painted murals with Persian swirls and Indian deities, while glassmakers in China puzzled over Roman recipes for crystal-clear goblets. And perhaps most powerful of all religion, The Silk Road became a highway for faiths, each new idea tucked into saddlebags alongside spices. Buddhism slipped east from India, carried by monks who traveled with caravans for safety. They preached in oasis towns, set up monasteries that doubled as inns, and painted their walls with stories of the Buddha that traders couldn't help but admire. Christianity followed later, especially in its Nestorian form, planting churches even in the heart of Tang-era China. Zoroastrian fire temples glowed in the night at way stations, and eventually, Islam spread across the routes too, reshaping Central Asia and beyond. What's striking is how these ideas blended rather than clashed, at least most of the time. A merchant might light a candle at a Buddhist shrine for safe passage, then offer coins at a Zoroastrian fire temple, hedging his bets with the divine. Caravanserais hosted conversations where Greek philosophy mingled with Indian logic, where Persian poetry charmed Chinese scribes. In the jumble of tongues and gods, people found ways to translate not just words, but meanings. This was cultural alchemy. The Silk Road wasn't a straight line, it was a messy braid. Goods were one thread, but ideas were the dye that colored the whole fabric. And once an idea hitched a ride, it rarely stopped. Paper, for example, invented in China, eventually slipped westward and rewrote the future of books, bureaucracy, and banking. Glass and winemaking, carried eastward, transformed Chinese tastes. Even food was a traveling idea. Grapes, pomegranates, peaches, walnuts, spices, entire cuisines rewrote themselves through trade. Imagine arriving in a Silk Road city, say Samarkand. You hear drums with unfamiliar rhythms. You smell curries spiced with things from far away. You see statues of gods you don't recognize. And yet it all fits somehow. The market isn't just a place to shop. It's a library of cultures, each stall another chapter. Of course, ideas could be dangerous cargo too. The Silk Road would one day carry something microscopic that toppled populations the Black Death. But for now, in these centuries of growth, the road buzzed with exchange that felt endlessly enriching. A merchant didn't have to understand Buddhism fully to admire a mural or master astronomy to navigate by stars. He just had to listen, observe, carry a little piece of it forward. And so, as silk rustled west and gold jingled east, knowledge, weightless, invisible, unstoppable, slipped between them. The Silk Road was never just about trade. It was humanity's greatest classroom. Tonight, if you're drifting towards sleep, let that be your picture. The desert quiet, except for a crackling fire, two strangers sharing a meal, and between them, not just bread, but ideas. No customs officer can tax them. No empire can truly own them. And once spoken, they never die. Picture the Silk Road in the first centuries of our era. Caravans creak through the dust, merchants bargain in half a dozen tongues, and somewhere amid the clamor, a saffron-robed figure walks quietly with his begging bowl. This isn't a trader, it's a monk, and he carries with him something less tangible than silk or jade, yet far more enduring: the teachings of the Buddha. Buddhism's journey along the Silk Road was almost accidental. At first, it was just monks tagging along with caravans, hoping for safety in numbers. But merchants were curious creatures, and after a long day's trek, when stories were swapped by firelight, those monks' tales of karma, rebirth, and liberation from suffering caught ears. Before long, the teachings became cargo, too spoken, written, painted, sculpted, moving eastward step by step. The Kushan Empire played a huge role in this spread. Ruling over lands that connected India with Central Asia, the Kushan kings didn't just tolerate Buddhism, they embraced it. One ruler, Kanishka, even sponsored Buddhist councils, monasteries, and stupas. Imagine his capital at Peshawar, buzzing with traders, diplomats, monks, and artisans. From there, caravans set out loaded not only with silk and spices, but also scrolls, statues, and monks ready to teach. And what art they carried. In the Gandhara region, roughly modern Pakistan and Afghanistan, sculptors, trained in the Greco-Roman style, began carving the Buddha in human form for the first time. No longer just footprints or empty thrones symbolizing enlightenment. Now there were serene faces, flowing robes, curls of hair that looked suspiciously Hellenistic. The Buddha suddenly resembled an Apollo who had chosen peace over the bow. This Greco-Buddhist fusion spread like wildfire along the road, influencing Buddhist art in every oasis city. Travel further north, and you reach Bamiyan. Nestled in a mountain valley, this site became famous for its colossal Buddhas carved straight into cliffs, towering over travelers like stone guardians of the road. Imagine approaching after weeks in the wilderness, your caravan weary, and suddenly these serene giants gaze down at you, arms open in welcome. They weren't just religious monuments, they were road signs of comfort and sanctuary. Monks there offered food shelter and advice about the dangerous passes ahead. Further east, in the desert town of Dunhuang, Buddhism blossomed into a kaleidoscope of art and devotion. Carved into caves were hundreds of murals, some tiny, some sprawling across entire walls. They showed Buddhas, bodhisattvas, heavenly musicians, and donors painted with faces that looked suspiciously like local merchants. In one cave, you might see Indian-style flowing robes, in another Persian-inspired designs, in yet another distinctly Chinese brushwork. Dunhuang became a gallery of the world, every stroke a story of cultural exchange. But Buddhism wasn't just art. It was logistics. Monasteries along the Silk Road doubled as rest stops. They gave weary merchants safe lodging, cared for their sick, and sometimes acted as banks storing valuables or even extending loans. Imagine trudging through a desert storm, then spotting the glow of lanterns from a monastery ahead. Inside, monks chant in a language you barely understand, but the beds are warm, the soup is hot, and you know your goods are safe for the night. Religion and commerce became entwined. And here's the beautiful irony. Buddhism's very emphasis on compassion and detachment from wealth made it perfectly suited to a world obsessed with wealth. Merchants trusted monks because they weren't supposed to cheat or steal. In return, merchants donated generously to monasteries, funding art libraries and monumental construction. The result? A religion that both transcended and thrived within the very marketplace of the Silk Road. Of course, every new culture it touched reshaped Buddhism a little. In Central Asia, it blended with local deities. In China, translators wrestled with how to explain karma and nirvana in terms familiar to Confucian and Taoist thinkers. Sometimes this meant creative reinterpretations, sometimes deliberate compromises. Over time, China developed its own flavors of Buddhism's Zen Pure Land, born from this cross-cultural stew. The road was also two-way. Just as Buddhism traveled east, Chinese pilgrims traveled west. Faxian in the 5th century, Xuanzang in the 7th. Both trekked across deserts and mountains to India, the homeland of their faith. Xuanzang's journey became legendary. He risked bandits' blizzards and dehydration to bring back authentic scriptures. When he returned, he didn't just haul scrolls. He carried stories, knowledge, and credibility that would fuel Chinese Buddhism for centuries. So while Roman matrons draped themselves in translucent silk, Chinese peasants and scholars were beginning to ponder the Buddha's Four Noble Truths. And both these transformations were made possible by the same caravans, the same routes, the same stubborn camels trudging through sand and snow. Buddhism also changed the very look and feel of Silk Road cities. Walk through Kashgar or Khotan, and you'd hear the drone of monks chanting sutras alongside the shouts of merchants. Monasteries stood near bazaars, their courtyards full of incense smoke and painted banners. Pilgrims mingled with traders, sacred relics were displayed next to market goods. Faith and commerce didn't just coexist, they fed each other. And through art, Buddhism left an enduring visual legacy. Imagine a traveler from Sogdia who had never seen a Buddha before. He enters a cave in Kucha and finds walls alive with celestial beings, bodhisattvas painted with gentle smiles. He doesn't convert instantly, but the images linger in his mind. Later, he describes them to his children. Slowly, the stories spread, the images echo. Ideas seeped like dye into fabric. In the end, Buddhism's spread along the Silk Road reminds us of a simple truth. Goods may enrich empires, but ideas enrich souls. And once an idea is loosed on the road, it cannot be recalled. The monks knew it, the merchants suspected it, and the weary travelers who found rest in monasteries felt it in their bones. So next time you think of the Silk Road, don't just picture bolts of silk or bags of spices. Picture also the quiet figure of a monk, sandals worn thin lips, murmuring a mantra as he walks into the desert. His faith is his cargo, his heart the caravan. And with each step, he carries the Buddha into new worlds. If the Han Dynasty lit the first sparks of the Silk Road, then the Tang Dynasty poured oil on the flame and turned it into a blazing torch. Between the 7th and 9th centuries, the road was not just alive, it was dazzling. And at the heart of this golden age stood Chang'an, the Tang capital, a city so vast and cosmopolitan that it made even Rome look like a provincial outpost. Let's set the scene. You're standing at the eastern gate of Chang'an around the year 750. The walls rise high above you, 30 feet of stone and brick, encircling a city that sprawls across 30 square miles. Inside, broad avenues stretch in perfect grids lined with tree shops and stalls. Each avenue is so wide you could march an army through it. And in some ways, that's exactly what happens. An army of merchants, pilgrims, scholars, and entertainers flowing in daily, each carrying pieces of the wider world. Step into the markets, and you might hear Persian spoken on one side, Sogdian on another, Indian dialects near the spice sellers, even scraps of Greek drifting from traders who'd wandered impossibly far east. Imagine the sensory overload: incense burning camels, bawling copper bells, jingling the air thick with the smell of roasting lamb sesame oil, and something sweet you can't quite identify. Chang'an was a feast, not just for the stomach, but for the imagination. And the goods. Oh, the goods. Silk, of course, still shimmering in bolts, stacked higher than a man's head. But now silk was joined by exotic spices from India and Southeast Asia, glassware from Rome and Byzantium, silver from Persia, jewels from Afghanistan, horses from Fergana, and musical instruments from everywhere in between. Grapes, pomegranates, walnuts, and cucumbers crowded stalls alongside peaches and tea leaves. If you wanted the world in miniature, you found it here. But the Tang era wasn't only about material wealth. It was about the confident embrace of diversity. Foreign embassies were welcomed into the city, their caravans parading through the gates with pomp. Monks from India translated Buddhist sutras in bustling monasteries. Persian musicians introduced new rhythms that Tang poets praised in their verses. Zoroastrian fire temples, Christian churches, Buddhist monasteries, and Taoist shrines coexisted within earshot of each other, their bells and chants weaving into a single strange harmony. And at the center of it all sat the Tang court, radiating both power and curiosity. The emperors and empresses of this age weren't afraid to show off their cosmopolitan tastes. Court banquets served dishes flavored with foreign spices. Court musicians played lutes and harps imported from Central Asia. Even fashion-tilted exotic Tang ladies strutted in long-sleeved gowns, inspired by Persian robes, their hair piled into elaborate knots, while men wore riding trousers suited to Central Asian horses. To be worldly was to be fashionable, and the Tang elite reveled in it. One of the most striking things about Tang Chang'an was how safe and organized it was for trade. The government maintained warehouses, regulated markets, and even scheduled trading hours to keep the chaos under control. Officials recorded transactions, ensuring taxes were collected and disputes resolved. Caravans from the west could unload with confidence, knowing they'd get a fair shake, well as fair as government officials ever give. The road itself, stretching west across deserts and mountains, was patrolled and protected. For a glorious century or two, the Silk Road was safer than it had ever been. And out of this safety, art and culture exploded. Tang poetry brimmed with foreign imagery, camels' desserts, Persian wine, and songs that drifted in from beyond the mountains. Painters captured exotic dancers with swirling sleeves, musicians with angular lutes, warriors astride magnificent horses that almost seemed to leap off the scrolls. The Tang world was one of curiosity absorption and fearless experimentation. Yet beneath the glitter lay fragility. The Tang Golden Age depended on stability, on strong borders, wealthy patrons, and steady flows of goods. And stability is always fleeting. Rebellions, famines, and wars would eventually fray the tapestry. But for a while, it felt eternal. Imagine walking through the West Market of Chang'an at dusk. Lanterns are being lit, casting a warm glow on stalls piled high with treasures. A Persian merchant haggles with a Chinese buyer over the price of frankincense. Nearby, an Indian monk chants softly, offering blessings for safe journeys. Children run between stalls, their laughter mixing with the bray of camels and the beat of drums. You tired from weeks on the road, sip a cup of wine flavored with spices you can't name, and for a moment you feel the world has shrunk to fit within these walls. That was the Tang gift to the Silk Road, a city that didn't just receive goods, but received the world itself, and then reflected it back in art, poetry, and philosophy. A place where East truly met West, not as enemies or strangers, but as partners in the great experiment of human exchange. For travelers, it must have felt like stepping into a dream. For us, it reminds us that trade is never just about commerce. It's about contact, curiosity, and the courage to let foreign things shape us. The Tang dynasty understood this, and for a shining moment, they turned the Silk Road into not just a highway of goods, but a highway of cultures. So, when you think of the Silk Road at its brightest, think of Tang Chang'an, a city humming with life where the world gathered, bargained, sang, and dreamed. A golden highway, indeed paved, not with gold, but with trust, curiosity, and 1,000 accents blending into one. Step back into Tang-era Chang'an and listen closely. Beyond the din of the markets and the clop of camel hooves, you hear something softer, stranger, a layering of prayers. Bells from a Buddhist monastery toll across the city walls. In another quarter, the low chant of Taoist priests drifts through pine incense. A few streets away, the crackle of sacred fire rises from a Zoroastrian temple. And in a quieter district, the murmur of Christian hymns in Syriac blends with the call of Muslim traders bowing toward the west. This was the Silk Road's other miracle. It didn't just carry silk and spices, it carried gods. Or perhaps more accurately, it carried ways of reaching toward the divine. The result was not a clash so much as a dance, a dizzying mingling of faiths, each finding its place in the patchwork of desert roads and mountain passes. Buddhism had already carved its path deep into China by this time, with monasteries dotting the route from Dunhuang to Luoyang. Monks translated Indian sutras into Chinese, grappling with unfamiliar ideas like emptiness and nirvana. Pilgrims stopped at temples along the road, lighting incense before setting out again. But Buddhism was not alone. Zoroastrians who worshipped fire as the visible presence of truth had built temples in many trading cities. Imagine walking into one of these sanctuaries, a chamber lit only by the glow of a sacred flame that had burned for years without interruption. Merchants bowed before it, seeking blessings for safe passage. The fire flickered against walls painted with winged figures, reminders of the eternal struggle between light and darkness. To a Chinese traveler, it must have seemed both exotic and oddly familiar. Wasn't Taoism too full of cosmic balances? Meanwhile, Nestorian Christians, followers of a branch of Christianity that had spread east after being declared heretical in the Roman Empire, found refuge along the Silk Road. In 635, they even received official permission to build a church in Chang'an. Picture that stone building rising among tiled roofs, its walls etched with crosses, its liturgy spoken in Syriac. Inside, perhaps a handful of Chinese converts knelt alongside Sogdian merchants. The teachings of Christ traveled here not by crusade, but by caravan. And then came Islam. After the rise of the Arab caliphates in the 7th century, Muslim traders surged into Central Asia, bringing with them not only goods, but the rhythms of daily prayer. They set up mosques in Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar, their minarets rising beside Buddhist stupas and Zoroastrian fire altars. Imagine a marketplace at dawn, monks lighting incense, priests chanting over flames, Christians singing hymns, and Muslim merchants rolling out their prayer mats, all within earshot of one another. How did they manage it without the city descending into chaos? Perhaps because the road itself demanded tolerance. When you're traveling thousands of miles with strangers, survival trumps sectarian squabbles. A caravan might include Buddhists, Muslims, and Zoroastrians, all tied together by ropes to keep from losing one another in a sandstorm. On the road, belief was less important than cooperation. That doesn't mean there were never tensions. Empires rose and fell, each with their favored faith. Some rulers leaned Buddhist, others Taoist, others Muslim or Zoroastrian. Periodically, one religion would gain official favor, while others were suppressed. But suppression rarely lasted. The Silk Road was too porous, too full of travelers carrying their gods in their saddlebags. Ban one faith, and it would reappear 3 towns down the road. The dance of faiths left lasting marks on art and architecture. In Dunhuang, murals show heavenly musicians with Persian features strumming Indian instruments, while Chinese bodhisattvas look on. In Samarkand, blue-tiled mosques rose near fire temples, their domes echoing older Zoroastrian sanctuaries. In Chang'an, foreign cemeteries filled with gravestones etched in Syriac Pahlavi and Arabic scripts. Every layer of paint, every carved stone whispered of multiple worlds colliding and mingling. And beyond buildings, ideas themselves blended. Taoist alchemists studied Buddhist meditation. Muslim mathematicians absorbed Indian numerals, which they later carried westward. Christian theologians debated Buddhist concepts of rebirth. The Silk Road was less a battlefield of faiths than a laboratory where doctrines were tested, rephrased, and sometimes hybridized in unexpected ways. Imagine for a moment a caravanserai at night. Merchants gather around the fire, their animals resting. A Buddhist monk chants softly under his breath. A Muslim merchant sets his compass to find west. A Zoroastrian quietly stokes a small flame, offering a prayer. And someone curious leans over to ask, "Why do you face that way? Why do you guard that fire? Why do you chant those words?" The answers pass into the darkness, weaving invisible threads across the desert. For the Tang capital, this pluralism was both a strength and a challenge. On one hand, it made Chang'an the most cosmopolitan city in the world, where travelers could find temples of every kind. On the other hand, it tested the empire's ability to balance diversity with unity. But for a long stretch of centuries, that balance held, and the Silk Road became the stage for faiths to dance side by side. The lesson is clear. When people meet at crossroads, their gods meet too. And the result is rarely purity. It is mixture, conversation, adaptation. The Silk Road was not just a market of goods, it was a market of souls, each faith offering its own answer to life's questions, each faith learning slowly to share the stage. So as you drift deeper into rest, tonight picture the flicker of many lights in the desert, the steady flame of a Zoroastrian altar, the soft glow of butter lamps in a Buddhist temple, the oil lamps of a Christian church, the stars above mirrored by the rhythmic bows of Muslim prayer. A dance of faiths, each step different, yet all moving together along the same endless road. The desert had always echoed with hoofbeats, but in the 7th century, a new sound rolled across the Silk Road, the thunder of Arab cavalry. They came not as merchants first, but as conquerors, banners of Islam snapping in the wind, Qur'ans tucked into saddlebags beside swords. And wherever they rode, the Silk Road shifted. After the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632, the Arab caliphates expanded with astonishing speed. Within a century, they controlled a sweep of territory, stretching from Spain to the Indus River. Think about that for a second. In less than 100 years, they created one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. And right in the middle of that empire lay the arteries of the Silk Road. To a weary merchant, this expansion was both terrifying and strangely comforting. Terrifying because sudden wars always meant disruption, raided caravans, unstable borders, shifting taxes. But comforting because once the dust settled, the road grew safer than it had been in centuries. Under the Umayyads and later the Abbasids, a new order stretched across deserts and cities. Law written in Arabic and grounded in Islamic principles gave traders predictable rules. Bandits might lurk in the wilderness, but an empire-wide system of justice and patrols made the road feel less like a gamble and more like a business plan. And business flourished. Muslims from the very beginning valued trade. The Prophet himself had been a merchant, and Islamic law treated commerce not as a necessary evil, but as a respected profession, provided you were honest. Contracts, weights, and measures, even bankruptcy protections, found space in Islamic jurisprudence. For Silk Road traders, this was gold without the glitter, a set of rules that made deals trustworthy. Then came the financial tools. Arab merchants perfected the use of letters of credit, known as sak, the ancestor of our modern check. Imagine being a trader in Damascus who wanted to buy silk in Samarkand. Carrying bags of gold across the desert was an invitation to bandits. Instead, you walked into a banker's office, deposited your gold, and received a written order guaranteeing payment in the east. Weeks later, dusty and half delirious from the journey, you handed over the paper in Samarkand, and like magic, the local banker paid out your funds. It was safer, faster, and revolutionary. The Arabs also brought innovations in navigation and mathematics, which, while most famous at sea, trickled onto caravan routes too. Astrolabes and improved compasses helped travelers orient themselves beneath the stars. Algebra and new number systems simplified accounting, making it easier to track profits across continents. You could say Islam didn't just reshape the road politically, it upgraded its software. But what about culture? Oh, it bloomed. Under the Abbasids, Baghdad rose like a jewel beside the Tigris River, a city designed almost like a mandala, circular walled radiant. Scholars there gathered books from Greece, Persia, and India, translating them into Arabic. Medicine, astronomy, philosophy, all poured into the house of wisdom, and caravans carried those ideas outward, spreading them as surely as silk. If earlier, the road had been a market of goods, and gods, Now it became a university without borders. Imagine a caravanserai around the year 800. A Muslim merchant unrolls his prayer mat, while nearby a Chinese trader carefully counts coins with abacus beads. Over the fire, they share dried figs and tea, and the Muslim explains a new system of numerals that will one day conquer the world, the digits 0 through 9. The Chinese man squints intrigued, perhaps sensing that these simple symbols will change bookkeeping forever. And yet the expansion wasn't smooth. In Central Asia, many local powers resisted. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara saw fierce battles before they became part of the caliphate. Zoroastrian fire temples flickered out under pressure, though their memory lingered in Islamic rituals. Buddhists and Nestorian Christians adapted as best they could, sometimes protected by Muslim rulers, other times squeezed out. The dance of faiths we described earlier didn't end, but the music changed. The Arabs brought not only faith, but also a new cultural style. Calligraphy bloomed across Silk Road manuscripts. Geometric patterns adorned caravanserais and mosques. Art turned away from depicting human figures, focusing instead on dazzling designs that seemed infinite, echoing the divine. To Chinese eyes, these patterns looked foreign but mesmerizing. Slowly, they seeped into textiles and ceramics, blending East and West in visual dialogue. Meanwhile, Islamic cuisine began to mingle with local tastes. Dates almonds, sesame citrus fruits. These flavors traveled with merchants enriching markets from Persia to Kashgar. Even coffee, though still centuries away from its worldwide fame, had its early seeds in the Arab world. The Silk Road didn't just carry fabric, it carried flavors, scents, and recipes that would eventually transform kitchens as much as wardrobes. Perhaps the most striking symbol of this new order was the mosque. As Muslim merchants settled in Silk Road cities, they built mosques not only as places of worship, but as community hubs. Picture a bustling Friday market in Bukhara. Goods changing hands, coins clinking, and above it all, the call to prayer echoing from a minaret. For travelers, it was both a reminder of home and a declaration Islam is here, woven into the fabric of the road. And in time, many Central Asians themselves embraced Islam. It wasn't only the sword that spread the faith, it was the appeal of belonging to a vast community, the Ummah, stretching from the Atlantic to the Himalayas. To join Islam was to join a network that offered not only spiritual guidance, but also practical benefits. Fair contracts, trusted partners, shared rituals. The Silk Road was never static. And with the Arabs came another transformation, one that lasted long after their cavalry stopped galloping. They reshaped the rules, the finances, the art, and the faiths of the road. And they did so with a confidence born of believing that trade itself was holy, that profit and prayer could march side by side. So when you picture the Arabs on the Silk Road, don't just see warriors with curved swords. See also the banker scribbling on a slip of parchment, the scholar copying Aristotle into Arabic, the merchant bowing in prayer before haggling over pepper. They came riding hard, yes, but they left the road richer, safer, and more connected than ever before. For centuries, the Silk Road had been a patchwork, safe in some stretches, perilous in others, its arteries clogged and cleared, depending on the mood of kings and the appetite of bandits. And then in the 13th century, thunder rolled down from the steppe. Not a storm of rain, but of horsemen. The Mongols had arrived. Imagine the sound, first a low rumble that grows into a roar. Tens of thousands of hooves striking the earth in rhythm, dust rising like storm clouds. To the settled cities of Central Asia, this wasn't just noise, it was doom. Genghis Khan's armies swept across the landscape like wildfire, devouring kingdoms that had stood for centuries. Samarkand, Bukhara, Nishapur cities that once dazzled with bazaars and scholars were toppled with terrifying speed. To those who resisted, the Mongols showed little mercy. To those who surrendered, they offered protection. Either way, the world was changing. It seems strange to say it, but from this wave of destruction came one of the greatest eras of connectivity the Silk Road had ever known. Historians call it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Under Genghis Khan and his successors, the road became safer, faster, and more reliable than ever before. The same empire that toppled cities also built a system that made trade flourish. How first the Mongols understood mobility. They were nomads, raised in the saddle, and they built their empire like a caravan on steroids. They established relay stations every 20 or 30 miles across their territories. Each station had fresh horses, food, and shelter. Couriers could ride hundreds of miles in a few days, swapping mounts at each post. Messages that once took weeks now sped across continents in days. Trade caravans piggybacked on this network, knowing safe havens awaited them at regular intervals. Second, the Mongols enforced order with ruthless efficiency. Banditry, long the plague of the Silk Road, virtually disappeared in Mongol lands. The punishment for attacking a caravan was swift and brutal, and word spread quickly: don't mess with the Khan's roads. For merchants, this was paradise. Suddenly, routes that once felt like gambling tables became dependable highways. Third, the Mongols were surprisingly open-minded about religion and culture. They didn't care if you prayed to Buddha, Christ, or Allah, as long as you paid your taxes and didn't rebel. This tolerance turned their empire into a sprawling cultural commons. In Karakoram, the Mongol capital, you could find Muslim mosques, Buddhist temples, Christian churches, and shamanic shrines standing side by side. It was as if the dance of faiths had been invited into the Khan's very living room. And then there were the travelers. The Mongol era opened the road wide for some of the most famous journeyers in history. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant, made his way east and later dazzled Europe with tales of Kublai Khan's court stories, of golden palaces, paper money, and postal systems that seemed unbelievable to his readers back home. Whether he exaggerated or not hardly mattered. His accounts fired the imagination of Europe and stitched the Silk Road into Western dreams. Other travelers, Persian scholars, Chinese artisans, Muslim envoys, crisscrossed the empire under Mongol protection. Knowledge zipped along the road. Paper-making techniques reached Europe. Gunpowder crept westward, and medical knowledge flowed in both directions. Even playing cards may have trotted along behind a caravan or two, shuffling cultures together as much as decks of kings and queens. But with these gifts came shadows. The same safe roads that carried silk and spices also carried something far darker: plague. The Black Death, likely nurtured in the rodent populations of Central Asia, found its way into caravans and ships during the 14th century. Rats and fleas hitched rides with merchants, and the disease spread faster than ever before, east to China, west to Europe, leaving devastation in its wake. The very success of Mongol infrastructure became the vector for one of history's deadliest pandemics. It's easy, though, to forget the quieter, more hopeful moments of this age. Picture a caravan under Mongol banners, crossing the steppe with unusual confidence. The camels plod, but the drivers are less anxious than in centuries past. They know the roads are watched. They know fresh water waits at the next yam. They know the Khan himself, somewhere far away, has decreed that merchants are precious to the empire's prosperity. The desert feels less like a trap and more like a thoroughfare. Imagine, too, the cultural exchanges at court. Kublai Khan, ruling from Beijing, entertained Persian astronomers, European travelers, and Chinese officials under the same roof. Dishes flavored with saffron sat beside bowls of rice and lamb stews. Scholars debated across languages, translators working furiously to keep up. To step into his palace was to step into the world, compressed into one glittering hall. The Mongols, in their blunt way, had done what no one else could. They made the Silk Road whole. Under their rule, a traveler could in theory journey from Korea to Hungary without leaving Mongol territory. It was the closest the road ever came to being a single unified highway. Of course, nothing lasts forever. After Genghis and Kublai, the empire splintered. Different khanates squabbled, the old safety nets frayed, and once again, the road grew perilous. But for a shining century, thunder had rolled across Asia, and instead of silencing trade, it had amplified it. So when you hear the name Mongol, don't think only of burning cities and piles of skulls. Think also of couriers galloping across the steppe caravans, moving under banners of protection, and knowledge sprinting faster than ever before. The Mongol thunder was violent, yes, but it was also connective, and its echoes still rumble in the history of trade travel and exchange. The Mongols had stitched the Silk Road together into a single artery. Caravans moved more confidently than ever, letters sped across relay stations, merchants swapped goods and ideas at record pace. But there was a stowaway, invisible, patient, and infinitely more dangerous than any bandit. Somewhere in the burrows of Central Asian rodents, a bacterium found its ticket to ride. And once it hitched itself to fleas, and then to humans, the great highway of prosperity became a black road of death. We know it today as the Black Death. In the 14th century, it ripped across Eurasia with a speed that would have seemed supernatural to those who lived through it. Entire cities were emptied, trade collapsed, and the very road that once promised fortune now whispered only of funerals. It began according to many accounts on the steppes, where plague had always lurked in wild animal populations. The Mongols, with their empire of movement, accidentally gave it wings. Rats crept into grain sacks, fleas rode on fur, and caravans carried them westward. Merchants who once exchanged bolts of silk and sacks of pepper now unknowingly exchanged a kiss of death. One chilling story comes from 1347 at the Crimean port of Kaffa. The Mongols besieging the city were themselves struck by plague. In desperation, or perhaps spite, they catapulted the infected corpses over the city walls. Whether or not this really happened, the image is unforgettable disease hurled as a weapon. The fleeing Genoese merchants carried the sickness aboard their ships, and soon the Mediterranean was infected. From there, the plague galloped like a dark rider. Constantinople, Alexandria, Venice, Paris, London, none were spared. By the time it finished its terrible sweep, as much as a third of Europe's population lay dead. And the Silk Road, once a ribbon of life, had become the channel of disaster. Picture a caravanserai that once rang with chatter and laughter. Now its courtyards are silent. Merchants lie fevered in corners, their bodies marked by black swellings under arms and groins. Camels stand untended packs still strapped to their backs. The air smells not of spices, but of decay. What once was a place of profit is now a morgue. In Central Asia, cities that had flourished for centuries faltered. Samarkand, once bustling with poets and jewelers, saw its streets emptied. In China, too, the population dropped dramatically. Crops rotted in fields because there were not enough hands to harvest them. Whole villages vanished from maps, abandoned to silence. The road itself seemed haunted, less a highway of hope than a graveyard stretching across continents. And yet, even amid the horror, the road could not die completely. Merchants still risked the journey, for need is stubborn. Empires still demanded revenue, and caravans still trudged forward. Though smaller, more cautious, their numbers thinned. The survivors adapted routes, shifted new tolls arose, and travelers clung tighter to whatever safety they could buy. The plague also reshaped belief. In Europe, it sparked waves of religious fervor and paranoia. Flagellants, whipping themselves in the streets, communities scapegoated churches, struggling to explain the wrath of God. In the Islamic world, scholars debated whether plague was a punishment or a test, while Sufi mystics whispered that suffering was a path to spiritual clarity. In China, dynastic cycles seemed confirmed, heaven withdrawing its mandate as emperors failed to protect their people. Along the Silk Road, shrines, temples, and mosques, filled with desperate prayers, all rising into the same indifferent sky. And here's the cruel irony: the very things that made the Silk Road powerful, its connections, its speed, its scale, were the things that turned it into a superhighway for disease. The same couriers who once carried paper money and trade contracts now spread infection. The same ships that bore spices across seas carried rats in their holds. Globalization, medieval style, had a cost. But history is rarely only tragedy. In the ashes of plague came unexpected transformations. Labor shortages in Europe gave surviving peasants leverage. They demanded higher wages, better conditions, more rights. The rigid hierarchies of feudal life began to crack. In the Islamic world, the devastation of plague pushed scholars to systematize medicine more rigorously, seeking cures in both scripture and science. In China, the Yuan dynasty weakened under the strain, and within decades it fell, making way for the rise of the Ming. The Black Death tore societies apart, but in tearing, it also reshaped them. Still on the Silk Road itself, the Golden Age dimmed. Caravanserais fell into disrepair. Once proud cities lost their luster. Where thousands once bustled, only a handful lingered. Merchants whispered more about survival than profit. And travelers, if they dared to set out, carried not only goods, but the memory of horror. Imagine trudging across the Taklamakan during those years. The dunes seem emptier, the oases quieter. At night, around the fire, no one tells the old jokes or sings the caravan songs. Instead, voices drop low, recounting towns where everyone is gone, where doors swing open to empty rooms, where graves outnumber the living. The stars shine, as they always have, indifferent, but the road beneath them feels cursed. Yet humanity is stubborn. Even death on such a scale could not erase the urge to move, to trade, to connect. Slowly, painfully, the Silk Road limped on, not with the roaring energy of the Mongol packs, but with a haunted persistence. The road had seen empires rise and fall, and now it had seen populations wither. But as long as there were camels to load and goods to sell, someone would always step onto its sands. The Black Death is a reminder that the Silk Road was never only a story of silk and spices, or of enlightenment and exchange. It was also a story of fragility, a thread so delicate that a flea no larger than a grain of rice could unravel it. So tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, picture the road under a different sky, moonlit, silent, lined with shuttered stalls and abandoned wagons. A road of ghosts, the black road of death. And yet, even in that darkness, a faint flicker of resilience remains. Because tomorrow, someone will still step forward and the road will begin again. The Silk Road had always been fragile, its lifeblood dependent on peace, prosperity, and the stubborn courage of merchants. By the 15th century, however, the winds of trade began to shift. The once mighty artery across deserts and mountains was no longer the only option. New seas were being charted, new routes, carved by sails instead of hooves. And slowly, inevitably, the ancient highway of silk began to fade. Let's begin in China. After the Mongol Yuan dynasty collapsed, the Ming rose in 1368 with a determination to restore Chinese identity and tighten control. In their early days, the Ming emperors flirted with outward expansion. The most famous example, of course, was Zheng He, the admiral who led massive treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean in the early 1400s. Imagine colossal ships larger than anything Europe would build for centuries, laden with silks, porcelain, and treasures gliding into ports as far away as Africa. It seemed like a seaborne Silk Road was being born. But then, in a dramatic reversal, the Ming court turned inward. Foreign trade was restricted, even banned outright in periods. Maritime expeditions ceased. Caravans were taxed and scrutinized. The fear was always the same: foreign influence might weaken the empire, drain its coffers, or invite new nomadic threats. The Ming mandarins believed in self-sufficiency. Better to lock the gates than to risk chaos outside. For Silk Road merchants, this was disastrous. The great overland exchanges shrank, oasis towns withered, and caravanserais stood emptier than before. The desert still stretched, the mountains still waited, but the traffic that gave them life dwindled. Meanwhile, to the west, another power was reshaping trade: the Ottomans. In 1453, they captured Constantinople, turning it into Istanbul, and planting themselves firmly astride the old east-west routes. Their empire grew to dominate the eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and much of the Middle East. And with dominance came tolls. The Ottomans were shrewd. They taxed trade, ruthlessly squeezing profits from every caravan and ship that passed through their lands. European merchants, especially the Venetians and Genoese, fumed. They wanted silk and spices, but the price tags kept climbing. Imagine a merchant in Florence staring at the latest shipment, calculating whether he could still make a profit after Ottoman duties. It was becoming harder and harder. And frustration, as it often does, drove innovation. So Europeans looked for alternatives. If the Ottomans blocked the land road, then why not go around them by sea? Portuguese sailors hugged the coast of Africa, inching southward year after year, mapping winds and currents. Finally, in 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India. The effect was like a cannonball shattering an old wall. Suddenly, goods that once trudged across deserts could sail directly into European ports. Spices, textiles, porcelain, faster, cheaper, and without Ottoman toll collectors glaring over ledgers. The Spanish took their own gamble. In 1492, Columbus set sail west, hoping to reach Asia by crossing the Atlantic. He stumbled on the Americas instead, and though he never found China, his voyage opened an entirely new chapter. Soon, Manila galleons would carry silver from the New World across the Pacific, exchanging it for silk and porcelain in Asia. The globe itself was shrinking, stitched not by caravans, but by sails. For the old Silk Road cities, this was a slow death. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, once bustling with caravans, now watching as traffic thinned. Some clung on through local trade, but the days of grand cosmopolitan markets faded. The desert roads became quieter, their echoes of camel bells replaced by silence. It wasn't only economics. The Mongol Empire's collapse had left the road fractured again. Rival khanates fought, robbers multiplied, and no single power could guarantee safety. The plague's devastation lingered in memory. And as ships grew stronger, safer, and more capacious, merchants simply chose the sea. Why gamble with sandstorms and tolls when the wind could carry you? Yet the Silk Road didn't vanish overnight. Pockets of life remained. The so-called tea horse routes carried Chinese tea into Tibet in exchange for sturdy ponies. Central Asian bazaars continued to buzz with regional trade. Pilgrims still crossed mountains to reach shrines and holy places. The road survived, but in pieces fragmented into local veins rather than a continent-spanning artery. And in Europe, even as caravels and galleons took center stage, the memory of the Silk Road lingered. Marco Polo's tales still fired imaginations. Maps still marked mysterious Serica and Cathay, even if no merchant would risk traveling there anymore. The Silk Road became less a living highway and more a legend, a golden thread in the tapestry of memory. Picture a caravan limping through the Taklamakan in the 1500s. The group is smaller, the goods fewer. At night, the fire burns low, and someone murmurs that ships now carry silk straight to Lisbon. The desert wind whistles carrying sand into empty caravanserais. Once these roads had hummed with life, now they feel like relics. The merchants push on stubborn, but deep down, they know the age of the land road is ending. What replaced it was not just new geography, but a new mentality. The Silk Road had been about endurance, the slow grind of deserts and mountains. The sea routes promised speed scale and eventually domination. Empires rose on sails, not saddles. And yet something was lost too, the intimacy of exchange, the face-to-face haggling the mix of faiths around a single fire. Ships carried cargo efficiently, but the caravan fires went dark. So the winds shifted. From Ming isolation to Ottoman tolls, from Portuguese sails to Spanish galleons, the old road was squeezed from both ends. It had been humanity's grand experiment in connection, but the world had outgrown it. Still, the Silk Road never truly died. Its paths remained etched in the sand, its cities scarred, but standing its legacy echoing in the global routes that replaced it. And in some sense, the very idea of global trade of East and West, locked in a perpetual embrace of desire and exchange, was the Silk Road's final gift to history. As you drift toward sleep, picture the sails rising on the horizon, white against a deep blue sea. The caravans of the desert shrink, their silhouettes fading. The winds have shifted, and the world is sailing into a new age. By the time the great sea routes took over global trade, many declared the Silk Road dead. But roads don't die so easily. Paths worn into sand and soil by centuries of hooves and boots have a way of enduring, even when the caravans dwindle. What truly happened was not death, but splintering. The grand artery fractured into smaller capillaries, local networks, stubborn roots, and quiet survivals that carried on long after the golden age was gone. Take the Tea-Horse Road, for example. Winding through the mountains of southwestern China and into Tibet, it became a vital trade corridor in its own right. Chinese tea, compressed into sturdy bricks that doubled as both beverage and currency, was carried by mule and yak across dizzying passes. In return, Tibet supplied horses, sturdy animals, bred for altitude and endurance. Imagine a line of yaks trudging up a snow-swept path, their backs piled high with tea bricks bells clanging softly in the thin air. At night, the caravaneers huddled under wool cloaks, sipping butter tea to fight the chill, the faint stars of the plateau glittering above. This was no global highway, but for those who lived along it, it was life itself. Elsewhere, Central Asia's bazaars remained stubbornly alive. Samarkand, Bukhara. Kashgar, though no longer crossroads of empires, they still buzzed with local commerce. Farmers brought in melons. Shepherds sold wool. Artisans hammered copper pots in shaded stalls. A traveler walking through these markets in the 1600s might not find Venetian merchants bargaining over silk anymore, but they would still hear a chorus of haggling laughter and gossip. The goods were humbler, the scale smaller, but the rhythm of trade continued. And don't forget the pilgrims. Faith rarely cares about profit margins. Buddhists still trekked to Dunhuang's caves. Muslims journeyed to Samarkand's mosques, and Christians sought holy relics tucked away in remote churches. Along these spiritual routes, inns and shrines remained open, providing the same mixture of shelter soup and stories as they had for centuries. The road, as a path of faith, endured even when it faltered as a path of silk. In some places, the splinters were deeply local. Villages maintained micro-trade with their neighbors, salt for grain, wool for pottery fruit for tools. These exchanges weren't glamorous enough to make it into official chronicles, but they mattered. The Silk Road had always been built on small steps. One bag of goods, handed off one jar of oil, swapped one bolt of cloth bartered. Even stripped of its global drama, that small-scale barter still thrummed. There were also seasonal fairs, temporary explosions of commerce that lit up otherwise quiet regions. Nomads descended from the steppes with hides and livestock. Farmers brought grain and fruit. Craftsmen displayed knives, jewelry, or embroidered textiles. For a few days, fields became cities of tents and laughter, the air thick with smoke from grills and the cry of hawkers. And then, as quickly as they appeared, they vanished again, leaving only trampled grass and memories. These fairs were like echoes of the old Silk Road, short-lived but powerful. In some ways, the splintering gave birth to cultural preservation. Without the constant flood of foreign merchants, some regions doubled down on their traditions. Local crafts blossomed. In Khotan, silk weaving persisted now, with a distinctly regional style. In Samarkand, artisans perfected blue-glazed tiles that turned mosques into shimmering gems. In Tibet, monasteries grew richer in art and ritual. If the Grand Road had once blurred cultural lines, its decline allowed local colors to shine brighter. Still, there was melancholy too. Imagine walking through a half-empty caravanserai. The arches are cracked, the stables dusty. Once, 100 camels might have crowded its courtyard. Now, only a handful chew, lazily, their drivers swapping weary gossip. The innkeeper shrugs. Times have changed, but the doors remain open. A few merchants still come, mostly locals, but the roaring tide is gone. The building feels like an aging storyteller, repeating tales of former glory to anyone who will listen. And yet history has a way of hiding resilience in plain sight. Even as European ships dominated global commerce, inland Asia remained tied together by these threads. Silk still moved, if in smaller amounts. Spices still traveled across passes. Silver flowing from Spanish mines in the Americas into China sometimes trickled inland along old routes. The scale was smaller, yes, but the network refused to vanish. What's fascinating is how memory of the Silk Road survived even when the reality changed. Poets still sang of caravans shimmering under the moon. Legends of distant lands and exotic treasures lingered in fireside stories. Travelers who walked the old paths felt they were stepping into history itself, treading on the footprints of countless others. The romance of the road outlasted its practical importance. So when people say the Silk Road ended in the 16th century, don't imagine a door slamming shut. Imagine instead a mirror shattering. The big reflection is gone, but the shards remain, each one glinting with smaller local light. A shepherd still loads wool onto a donkey to sell in town. A pilgrim still trudges toward a sacred cave. A farmer still walks to a market where he knows the spice seller by name. These are splinters, yes, but they are survivals too. The road lived on quietly, humbly, waiting for future centuries to rediscover it. And perhaps that is the secret of the Silk Road. It was never a single road, never a single moment. It was always fragile, always shifting, always reinventing itself. Even in decline, it whispered, reminding the world that humans will always find ways to connect, even if only with the neighbor over the next hill. As you drift deeper tonight, picture those smaller scenes. Yaks trudging through mountain passes, with bricks of tea bazaars echoing with laughter, though fewer in number. Pilgrims lighting candles in caves, while wind rattles the desert outside. The Grand Road may have splintered, but its heartbeat never stopped. By the 19th century, the caravans that once carried silk and spices across Asia had dwindled to trickles. The old road was quieter, its bazaars smaller, its caravanserais crumbling. But the Silk Road never truly disappeared. It lingered like a faded map, waiting for someone to trace its lines again. And in the 1800s, two new powers stepped into the desert not to trade, but to compete. Britain and Russia turned Central Asia into a chessboard, and the old Silk Road became their playing field. This rivalry became known as the Great Game. It was a contest not of merchants, but of spies, soldiers, and surveyors. The British ruling India feared that Russia might one day sweep south across the mountains and threaten their empire. The Russians, expanding eastward from Moscow, dreamed of reaching warm water ports and controlling trade routes of their own. And caught in between were the ancient cities of Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, the ghosts of Silk Road, glory suddenly thrust back into the spotlight. Picture a dusty street in Bukhara. The minarets still stand tall. The bazaars still murmur with trade. But now strangers move among the locals. A British officer in disguise, perhaps dressed as a merchant, scribbles notes about the city's defenses. A Russian envoy measures the distance between wells, calculating how far an army might march. Each side sends adventurers, explorers, even archaeologists, not only to map the land, but to claim the memory of the Silk Road as their own. Archaeologists, in particular, played curious roles in this imperial drama. Men like Aurel Stein, Sven Hedin, and others trekked into deserts once thought impassable. They unearthed manuscripts in Dunhuang's caves, uncovered murals faded by sand, carried statues and relics back to museums in London, Paris, and St. Petersburg. To them, it was scholarship. To locals, it often felt like plunder. But their work, however controversial, revived global fascination with the Silk Road. Suddenly, what had been forgotten ruins became front-page wonders in Europe's newspapers. The irony is thick. Centuries earlier, caravans had brought Buddhism and paper to the West. Now, Westerners returned eastward to dig those same treasures out of the sand and ship them back. The Silk Road had become a road of memory as much as trade. Meanwhile, the Great Game itself played out in secrecy and shadow. Britain sent surveyors disguised as holy men, their robes concealing measuring tools. Russia dispatched Cossacks to escort envoys, their sabers flashing in the sun. Rumors swirled of secret treaties, of plots to topple khans, of agents bribing local rulers. It was less a war of armies and more a war of nerves, each empire testing the other's resolve in the deserts and passes of Central Asia. For the people who actually lived along the old road, this contest must have felt bewildering. Local rulers, emirs, khans, tribal leaders were courted one month, threatened the next. Some accepted Russian protection, others leaned toward British friendship. Many tried to play both sides. And through it all, the bazaars limped on selling fruit wool and carpets barely touched by the grand strategies playing out above their heads. Yet the presence of these new powers did change things. Roads were surveyed, maps redrawn, telegraph lines slowly crept in. Where once camel caravans trudged, now railroads began to snake. The Russians, in particular, pushed their iron tracks into Central Asia, binding the region into their empire. The Silk Road, once a ribbon of sand, was becoming a ribbon of steel. And still, amid the politics, the romance of the Silk Road rekindled. Travelers wrote memoirs describing ruined cities half buried in dunes, monks' caves with fading murals, marketplaces where the echo of 1,000 tongues seemed to linger even in decline. Western readers devoured these accounts, imagining themselves in caravans under starry skies, sipping tea in smoky tents, bargaining over turquoise and silk. The Silk Road became less a reality and more a legend fuel for armchair adventurers in London, drawing rooms, and Paris cafes. The Great Game ended not with a bang, but with exhaustion. By the early 20th century, both Britain and Russia faced new challenges. Revolutions, world wars, and shifting borders made their competition seem less urgent. But the mark they left remained. Central Asia was no longer forgotten. Its deserts had been mapped, its ruins cataloged, its memory revived. The Silk Road had been rediscovered not as the artery of global trade it once was, but as a stage for imperial rivalry and historical romance. Imagine walking through Samarkand in the 1890s. The Registan, once the beating heart of Timurid grandeur, still towers, its blue tiles shimmering under the sun. But now, Russian officials stroll the square, their boots echoing on the stones. British spies disguised in local robes pass unnoticed in the crowd. Children chase each other through alleyways where Marco Polo once might have wandered. The city is no longer a global hub, but it is no longer forgotten either. The Great Game has made it part of the world's imagination again. So the Silk Road of the 19th century was not about silk, not about caravans. It was about memory empire and the strange persistence of a road that refused to disappear. Splintered, weakened, nearly forgotten, and yet it remained a prize worth playing for. And perhaps that is the road's greatest trick. It never truly dies. It waits. It shifts form from camel paths to railroads, from bazaars to museums, from trade to legend. Even when it seems buried, someone always comes digging, dreaming, and chasing its ghosts. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture the desert at twilight. Two riders approach from opposite horizons, one British, one Russian. They meet at a lonely well exchange guarded words and ride on. Around them, the sands whisper with older stories of caravans, monks, emperors, and merchants. The Great Game is just another chapter in the endless book of the Silk Road. By the 20th century, the caravans of the Silk Road were mostly memories fading like footprints in the sand. Yet the road itself, those dusty passes, those crumbling bazaars, refused to vanish. Empires had risen and fallen upon it, and now a new one arrived to claim its stretches, the Soviet Union. For the Soviets, Central Asia was less a land of romance and more a resource bank. Cotton fields, oil wells, minerals, all waiting to be harnessed. The old caravan towns, once proud and independent, were folded into the red map of Moscow's control. Samarkand and Bukhara became Soviet Republic cities. Their turquoise domes still shimmered, but now under the gaze of party officials. And instead of camels, steel rails began to dominate. The Soviets built railroads across Central Asia, binding the region to Moscow. Picture a train steaming across the steppe, its whistle cutting through silence where once only bells of camels rang. Freight cars carried not silk or spices, but coal grain and troops. The iron horse replaced the Bactrian camel. The Silk Road was reborn, not as a path of caravans, but as a Soviet supply line. The Soviets were not sentimental about history. Many caravanserais fell into disrepair, their stones quarried for new buildings. Religious sites, mosques, monasteries, temples were closed or repurposed in the campaign against faith. The vibrant dance of religions that once defined the road was muffled, replaced with the slogans of Marx and Lenin. The ancient highway of gods became a secular corridor of factories and collective farms. And yet, the past has a way of whispering even through concrete. Archaeologists, both Soviet and foreign, continued to dig. The caves of Dunhuang yielded thousands of manuscripts, carefully cataloged now under the eyes of scholars instead of treasure hunters. In Samarkand, restorations began to preserve the Registan, though often in heavy-handed Soviet-style, part archaeology, part propaganda. The Silk Road was reframed not as a romantic tale, but as evidence of the long unity of Eurasian peoples under socialism. Still, something stirred in the imagination. Travelers, rare but real, wrote accounts of wandering Soviet Central Asia. They described turquoise domes rising over gray apartment blocks, bazaars still humming quietly despite official disapproval, tea houses where old men told stories of ancestors who had crossed deserts under stars. The Soviets may have imposed silence, but beneath it, memory lived on. Then came World War II, and once again, Central Asia's geography became crucial. Troops and supplies moved along Soviet rail lines that often paralleled the bones of the old Silk Road. The irony was almost too neat. The road that once carried silk to Rome now carried tanks and rifles to the front. The arteries of exchange had become arteries of survival. After the war, the Silk Road slowly shifted from Soviet utility to global curiosity. Western scholars and tourists, when allowed, began to peek into Central Asia. They marveled at Samarkand's mosques, at Bukhara's labyrinthine streets, at the desert ruins of Merv. UNESCO and other organizations started whispering about preservation, about protecting what remained of this fragile thread of human history. Slowly, the Silk Road moved from a forgotten backwater into a symbol of global heritage. By the late 20th century, the road returned not as a highway of trade, but as a dream. Tourism brochures promised journeys along the ancient Silk Road. Museums curated exhibitions of silk jade and manuscripts. Writers and filmmakers spun tales of Marco Polo, of monks in saffron robes, of merchants haggling in bazaars. The road was no longer alive in the same way, but it lived in our imaginations, polished into legend. For the people who lived along it, this shift was double-edged. On one hand, the revival brought attention, investment, and pride. Cities like Samarkand and Kashgar became tourist magnets, their monuments restored, their histories celebrated. On the other hand, commercialization sometimes smoothed the rough edges of reality. A staged dance in a heritage show is not the same as the messy, vibrant mix of faiths and tongues that once filled the markets. The Silk Road had become a performance as much as a place. And yet for travelers who stood in those cities, the magic was real enough. Imagine walking through Samarkand at sunset in the 1980s, the Soviet Union still in place, but cracks beginning to show. The Registan glows golden, the blue tiles radiant against the evening sky. Children play football in the square, their laughter echoing between madrasas. Old men sip tea and gossip in shadowed corners. Tourists snap photographs imagining caravans that once stopped here. The past and present blur, and for a moment, the Silk Road feels alive again. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, the newly independent nations of Central Asia embraced the Silk Road as part of their identity. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan all reached back into history, polishing the Silk Road as a source of pride, a heritage that linked them not just to Moscow, but to the wider world. Governments restored monuments, opened museums, and promoted Silk Road tourism. The dream of caravans became a banner for nation building. Meanwhile, UNESCO declared stretches of the road World Heritage Sites. Scholars published volumes, travelers penned memoirs, and school children learned again of deserts and camels. The Silk Road, once a forgotten corridor of dust, had become a global symbol of connection. From Soviet rails to international heritage, it had transformed yet again. And perhaps that is the most fitting destiny for the road. It was never static. It shifted shape with every century: camel path, trade highway, imperial chessboard, Soviet rail line, tourist trail. Each age saw what it needed in the road and reshaped it accordingly. So, tonight, as you picture the Silk Road, don't only see the caravans of Han and Tang. or the thunder of Mongol hooves. Picture also a Soviet train steaming across the steppe, its whistle echoing in valleys once filled with camels. Picture archaeologists brushing sand from a manuscript in a cave. Picture a modern tourist standing in awe before a turquoise dome, dreaming of merchants long gone. From Soviet rails to silk, dreams the road never ended. It simply shifted, waiting for each generation to find itself upon it. And now, at last, we arrive in our own century. The caravans are long gone. The Mongol relay stations have crumbled to dust. Even the Soviet trains rattle less importantly than before. But listen closely, and you'll hear a familiar phrase echoing through news reports, summit speeches, and glossy brochures: the Silk Road. The name has returned, dressed in modern clothes. No camels this time, but cargo ships' pipelines and fiber optic cables. No caravan, serays, but airports' highways and special economic zones. And no imperial Khan issuing edicts, but governments drafting contracts and signing memoranda of understanding. The Silk Road has been reborn as the Belt and Road Initiative, China's vast 21st century project to connect continents once again. It is both an echo and an evolution, half history lesson, half global strategy. Step into a modern port on the coast of China. Containers stack like colored bricks against the sky, each one stamped with numbers and logos. Cranes swing overhead, lifting steel boxes the size of small houses onto giant ships bound for Europe, Africa, the Middle East. This is the new Silk Road by sea, a maritime highway that flows across oceans rather than deserts. Tea and silk have been replaced by electronics, machinery, and textiles. But the logic is the same move: goods earn wealth, connect the world. Meanwhile, on land, trains thunder westward across the steppes, following old caravan routes, but with steel wheels instead of camel hooves. A modern freight train can leave Yiwu in eastern China and arrive in Madrid in under 3 weeks. To put that in perspective, what once took a caravan half a year or more can now be done in days. The dream of a seamless road has finally been realized, though the beasts of burden are engines instead of animals. But it isn't just goods that travel. Fiber optic cables snake beneath roads carrying data at the speed of light. Oil and gas pipelines trace paths once walked by merchants. Air routes crisscross connecting hubs like Beijing, Dubai, and Istanbul. The old Silk Road, once fragile and slow, is now humming with technology. And yet the symbolism matters as much as the steel. Why call it the Silk Road at all? Because the phrase still sparkles with romance. It conjures images of camels under starry skies, bazaars filled with spices, cities where gods mingled. By invoking the Silk Road, modern states link themselves to a history of exchange, cooperation, and shared destiny. It's public relations as much as policy, but it works. People remember the road not just as geography, but as an idea that humanity is connected by trade and curiosity. Still, as in the past, the road is not without controversy. Just as the Parthians taxed caravans, modern governments imposed tariffs. Just as Mongol Khans demanded loyalty, modern powers demand alignment. Critics argue that the Belt and Road brings debt as much as opportunity, that it favors the lender more than the borrower. Others point out that new highways cut through fragile ecosystems, that local voices are sometimes drowned out by global ambitions. The old questions remain only updated for a world of satellites and spreadsheets. But perhaps that is fitting. The Silk Road was never a story of pure harmony. It was always messy, part profit, part plunder, part wonder. The new Silk Road is no different. It carries hope and anxiety in equal measure. What's remarkable is how the ancient cities stir again under this revival. Samarkand, Bukhara, Kashgar, names that once slipped into legend, are once again whispered in boardrooms and conferences. Tourists flock to their domes and bazaars, Scholars retrace old manuscripts, and politicians pose for photographs beneath restored arches. The ghosts of merchants smile, perhaps seeing their markets alive again, even if the goods are smartphones instead of silk. And through it all, the essence remains exchange. Goods, ideas, people, even viruses still move along the arteries that link our world. The Silk Road is no longer a dusty path. It is highways, shipping lanes, digital cables. But the impulse is the same. We crave connection. We crave what others have. We crave the stories, flavors, and colors that lie beyond the horizon. So tonight, as we close this journey, picture the arc of history. From mulberry groves, where silkworms spun their cocoons, to Roman women scandalizing senators with shimmering gowns. From monks painting caves in Dunhuang to Mongol couriers galloping through the night. From plague carts rattling through Europe to Soviet trains steaming across the steppe. And now from cargo ships stacked with containers to fiber optic cables glowing with data. The Silk Road has never been just a road. It has been a mirror showing us humanity's hunger for beauty, power, knowledge, and connection. Sometimes that hunger has brought flourishing. Sometimes it has brought ruin. But always it has carried us forward. As you drift into sleep, let the images blend. Camels under a desert moon, ships with sails full of wind trains clattering across plains, data flashing unseen beneath oceans. Past, present, and future, all woven together like threads in a single vast fabric. A fabric as delicate as silk, as enduring as human desire. The road goes on in one form or another, and so does the story.